Actually, I'm
Recording in progress.
gonna just move here. Okay, pursuant to the Open Public Meetings Act, public notice of this meeting has been given by the board secretary in the following manner. On posting written notice. I'm sorry, bear with me. I'm like all discombobulated all of a sudden. Posting written notice on the official bulletin board at the Voorhees Township Public Schools Administrative Building on March 28th, 2023 and April 4th, 2023. Sent written notice to the Courier Post on March 28th, 2023 and April 4th, 2023. Written notice with the clerk of Voorhees Township on March 28th, 2023 and April 4th, 2023. And posting on the Voorhees Township website on March 28th, 2023 and April 4th, 2023. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Board Secretary, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Bryce,
Here.
Mrs. Cosenza,
Here.
Ms. Kedover,
Here.
Dr. Levy, Mr. Rosner,
Here.
Mrs. Rudder,
Here.
Mrs. Stupler,
Here.
Ms. Verdi,
Here.
Mrs. Watson.
Here. Okay, we are going to immediately go into executive session so that some of our visitors won't have to suffer through the rest of our meeting. I do not expect the executive session to go around 30 minutes. And then we should be back to conduct the rest of our business. Okay, so whereas the Open Public Meeting Act authorizes Board of Education to meet in executive session under certain circumstances, whereas the Open Public Meeting Act requires the board to adopt a resolution at a public meeting to go into private session. Now therefore be it resolved by the Voorhees Township Board of Education that it is necessary to meet in executive session to discuss certain items involving matters involving the purchase of real property and or the investment of public funds, and matters involving personnel issues, including but not limited to employment, appointment, termination, or the termination of employment, terms and conditions of employment, evaluation of performance, promotion, or discipline of any public officer or employee. Be it further resolved that any discussion held by the board which needs to remain confidential will be made public as soon as feasible. The minutes of the executive session will not be disclosed until the need for confidentiality no longer exists. Further resolved that the board will return to open session to conduct business at the conclusion of the executive session. Can I get a motion to adjourn to executive session?
So moved.
Second.
Do you want me to roll call or should we just say unanimous? Unanimously, we're going into executive. Thank you.
Yeah, we're having trouble. That's why I was like, okay.
She looked at me, she like, I was like.
To report, correct?
Recording in progress.
Superintendent report.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I am pleased to inform the community that after an extensive search that consisted of multiple rounds of interviews and targeted questions and activities, we have selected a candidate for principal of Signal Hill, and the name appears on the agenda this evening. The candidate is Lauren Sauls, who was a former staff member of Voorhees, so we would like to bring her back home. She worked at E.T. Hamilton and at the middle school. She is currently a principal in the Hainesport Township School District, where her responsibilities include overseeing the daily operations of the school building while also supervising the district's child study team to ensure compliance. Ms. Sauls is a dedicated and experienced administrator with a proven track record of success. So tonight, board members, I bring her forward for your consideration. We have our next virtual parent workshop series on April 25th, and our very own Director of Technology, Bruce Taylor, will be presenting a workshop along with his team on our district's technology plan. So I hope our parents can join us on April 25th, 6 o'clock. It is virtual. Our Elementary Enrichment Math Committee met on March 22nd, and our plan now is to offer enrichment math to students in grades 4 and 5 next year. We'll be working on selection criteria and instructional pacing at our next meeting on April 27th. And I'd like to thank Dr. Young for spearheading that meeting. We also had our first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee meeting on April 26th, and it was great. We actually have subdivided the committee into subcommittees. One is a website committee, a communications committee, curriculum and resources committee, professional development, and community outreach. We'll work on developing a parent and guardian survey so that we can obtain information related to religious and cultural observances of our families. And I'd like to thank Sue Donnelly, who oversees that committee. Tonight, we are indicating that our performance report from 21-22 has now been released by the New Jersey Department of Education. This is from the 21-22 school year. On August 29th, 2022, Dr. Young did a report on this performance report, and she went over the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment data. That report can still be available to anyone who would like to see it, but the state is now formally releasing that report. A letter has gone out to parents, and also the report is posted on our website. The only thing that Dr. Young did not present on August 29th, which was not available at that time, was the chronic absenteeism data. So I'll share that with you this evening very quickly. For our elementary schools, the state average for chronic absenteeism in the 21-22 school year was 17.8%. It's pretty high. 17.8% was the state average, and chronic absenteeism is a student who misses 18 or more days in a school year. So 17.8 was the average. Our schools, and I'm going to do an order of the least amount of chronic absenteeism to the greatest, start with E.T. Hamilton at 7.1, Signal Hill at 7.3, Crescent at 8.7, and Osage at 10.9. So although we don't want to see any numbers, any high numbers in chronic absenteeism, we are well below the state's chronic absenteeism average. For our middle school, the state average was 16.4, and Voorhees Middle School had 11.5. So we continue to work with our students who are chronically absent by mentoring them and contacting their parents. As a district, the state average was 17.3 for school districts, and we were at 9.6. So we are below the state average. And the final announcement today is the district will be participating in Take Your Child to Work Day. We're excited about that on April 27th. So all of our district staff are invited to bring their children to work on April the 27th. That ends my report.
Thank you so much. There are no committee reports, audience participation. Anyone wishing to address the board, please approach the side table on the right and write your name and address on the login sheet. If you are attending via Zoom, please use the raise your hand feature to be acknowledged. While the board is limited, excuse me, in its ability to respond to the public on matters involving personnel, litigation, negotiations, and attorney-client privilege, the board will now hear comments from the public relating to the items on the agenda for this board meeting. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. The board will not take action this evening. You will be notified at some later time by letter, electronic mail, telephone, or in the context of a later board meeting of any action the board does take. Okay. Board member comments? Moving right along, there are no items under policy or curriculum. Personnel, can I get a motion to approve all of the items under personnel?
So moved.
Second.
Voting is open.
After you click it.
You want to give your response orally?
And
Motion unanimously passes. Voting is closed.
There are no items under transportation, building and grounds. Can I get a motion to approve all of the items under building and grounds?
So moved. Second.
Online voting is open. Motion unanimously passes.
No items under finance. Public comment. Anyone wishing to address the board, please approach the side table on the right and write your name and address on the login sheet. If you're attending via Zoom, please use the raise your hand feature to be acknowledged. While the board is limited in its ability to respond to the public on matters involving personnel litigation, negotiations, and attorney-client privilege, the board will now hear comments from the public. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. The board will not take action this evening. You will be notified at some later time by letter, electronic mail, telephone, or in the context of a later board meeting of any action the board does take. Yes.
Evening, everyone. We have a 3-year-old and we're crossing our fingers and everything else we can. He gets into the new Crescent expansion this coming fall. But something that I wanted to talk to you about or ask about really is the middle school. We moved here 2 years ago and we've met so many great people. Lots of other parents that either that have kids in the school district, a little bit older, and we've had an opportunity to ask them, what was your experience? And almost unanimously across the board, they were very complimentary of the elementary school. They were not complimentary of the middle school. Their experience in the middle school was very different, to the point where, we're looking long term and we're like, man, are we going to have to go into private when we get to that point? Because we just can't afford to have that kind of a bump in his educational path. So as a board, I'm sure this is something you're aware of. The test results, scores, satisfaction, you have insight into all that. So I'm not telling you anything that I'm guessing you already know. You don't already know. So are you formulating a plan to look at addressing and getting that changed over the coming years? Are you ramping up your staff? Are you pumping money into your frontline people, your teachers? If this was like an NBA team, the arena doesn't really matter as much as, you can have all these ancillary services as people on the court. That's where you put your money. Are we looking at stacking more money into and to the teachers, how are you addressing that problem? Like, what's your long-term solution? So that by the time he gets there, it's not even a question in our minds. Of course, he's going to go to the middle school and in public. So just letting you know that that's a concern of mine. And I'm sure there's lots of other parents that have that same concern because they're all hearing the same stories. So, and that's really a lot of what we go on. So anyway, just heads up, and hopefully we'll hear more on what you're doing to address that.
Thank you. Moving to board comments before I'm sorry. We have a comment. Okay.
Hi, Diana Brown. I'm just curious about if we're doing more about security, or especially in recent events with the PFA doing things during school hours, like book fairs. I just want to, I guess, know what's going on with all that. That's it. Thank you.
I'm sorry, you went out, so we couldn't hear everything that you said. Could you repeat that?
Sorry, I was just curious what's going on with PFA and like book fairs and security. Oh, sorry, Roy. And I just want to check that everything is okay and that we have a plan going forward. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, were we?
Any other comments? Before I open the comments up to the full board, two things. I want to welcome Lawrence Halls. We are so excited to have you as part of the Signal Hill family. And if I am correct, you have some words that you would like to say. So I'd like to invite you up to share with the board.
Thank you so much, Board President Watson and members of the Voorhees Township Public Schools Board of Education, Dr. Hackett, and the interview committee. I'm Lauren Sals, and I am so grateful to once again serve the community of Voorhees Township. As Dr. Hackett mentioned, I began my educational career in Voorhees back in 2009 as a fourth grade student teacher at E.T. Hamilton. And then shortly thereafter, I became an eighth grade math teacher at the middle school. And then during that time, I taught in the district's extended school year program in grades K through 5. And the program itself was taught at Signal Hill Elementary School. So as you can imagine, it's a very much a full circle moment for me, to say the least. And I've always seen myself returning to Voorhees Township Public Schools. It's a district that's very near and dear to my heart. It's one that I've always considered home, being that it's where I began my career. And during my tenure as principal, I've learned a lot about the skills needed to cultivate a school culture that's built on inclusivity and diversity, equity, and respect, as well as the importance of building positive relationships with not just the students, but also the staff and, of course, the families of the school community. So to say that I'm humbled and honored is an understatement, to not only return to Voorhees Township Public Schools as principal of Signal Hill Elementary, but also to share my love of children and my enthusiasm for learning with the students, staff, and families of Signal Hill Elementary. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know how you can't be excited about that. So I'm going to open up to the rest of the board. Seeing no comments, we are not going back to executive session. Our next meeting date will be on May 3rd, 2023. It will be a public budget hearing and district reorganization meeting. And now we will move into board ethics training.
Well, anyone who's here, they do.
Oh, yes. You all don't need to stay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Bye.
From school boards? Was it Jesse? Yeah. Okay, I like Jesse.
Ooh. Yes.
All right. I'm gonna do this because this is for you guys. So
Apologies to anyone who I've got my back to, but this is really for the board. I know that Bruce has got the slides. I think that's the last slide, Bruce, that you're on. So this is obviously part of the public meeting, just while Bruce is putting this together. And I'm always, I always welcome the public hearing some of this because I think it's, not the easiest, most intuitive stuff. But this is really for you guys, for the board. I want this to be as conversational as possible. I want people to ask questions and I want this to be accessible, user-friendly, because there's a lot of things about the code of ethics that aren't necessarily. Bruce, you want me to wait or are you good? Okay. Okay. So there's a couple, there's some stuff I can talk about while he's doing that. So you guys know, you saw it on your reorg agenda that under the administrative code, the Board of Education has to once a year annually discuss and review the code of ethics for school board members. So the code of ethics for school board members is part of a broader piece of legislation called the School Ethics Act. This piece of it, the code of ethics, is specifically for school board members. The School Ethics Act at large is applicable to school board members and also school administrators. So there's a little bit of a distinction there worth knowing. What we're going to talk about tonight is the code of ethics. It's like subsections A through J. The way that the code is structured is that there's the piece of it that's the code, and then the code of ethics, that's the statute. Then in the administrative code, which is written by the Department of Education, it tells you what the proof of a violation of that section is. So there's more slides here than we're going to go through. I'll have the PDF available for you guys. I'm going to go through just the first subsection of it, showing you each aspect of it, but then we're going to go through and talk about case notes mostly. All right, so Bruce, you can go ahead. Okay. So this is just a quick overview of what I just talked about. You can actually advance forward. This is just the board's obligation to discuss it every year. This is School Ethics 101. So the Code of Ethics is really about telling you guys as board members what your role is here. So these are some broad concepts here. You guys are the governing body of the school district. You're charged with high-level policy-making decisions as opposed to daily administration. You are the only entity that can enter into contracts or any binding agreements. Your decision-making authority is very limited and you cannot administer the schools. And in most situations, you cannot act without the recommendation of the chief school administrator. You guys will see that acronym CSA out there a lot. That just means superintendent. It's just easier than writing it out, but it means chief school administrator. You can go ahead. So this is one of my favorite and more important slides here, okay? The code of ethics is it's not the floor, right, of your behavior. It's not the minimum standard of conduct. It's not just the basic laws, but it's also not the ceiling. It's not your personal morals. It's not your personal beliefs. It helps you navigate everything in between there. And for anyone who's ever told you that ethics are not situational, that is incorrect in this particular concept. Ethics are inherently situational, and specifically in the context that we're talking about, the code is designed to tell you what your role is and what stepping out of it looks like. Okay. So if you take anything from tonight, right, I don't want you to feel like you have to memorize or remember any of this. I want you to walk away knowing when to ask a question. That's it. So listen just enough to be like, oh, I feel like Alicia said something that maybe sounds like that. Maybe I should talk to Monica and see if this is an issue. That's all I need you to do. You just need to know when to ask questions. And I can tell you, there's enough lawyers on this board, right? Like you guys know that's what our code of ethics is. Like our rules of professional responsibility tell us when we have to go talk to a colleague, get an advisory opinion about whether there's some conflict in our representation. Asking those questions doesn't make us unethical, it makes us ethical. So that's how you need to think about the code here. It's not an indictment. It's not like you're wrong if you did this. There are a lot of things you'll see in this that you can trip over. These things are not intuitive, okay? Go ahead. So the first section of the code, and like I said, you're gonna see the slideshow kind of unfold. For each subsection, there's 10 sections of the code of ethics. There's going to be the actual code. The next slide is going to be the evidence of the violation, which I'll go through pretty quickly. And then I've got a couple case notes under each section, just so you guys have some idea what it looks like in practice. So subsection A here is just I'm going to follow the rules. I'm going to follow the law. Okay. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you. You can go ahead. The evidence of the violation, this is what's really interesting. The evidence of a violation is actually a copy of a final decision from a court or administrative agency of this state. So interesting side note, the School Ethics Commission is the body, they're appointed by the governor, they oversee the School Ethics Act, they review charges brought under the Code of Ethics for school board members and the conflict of interest provisions. About 95% of what's filed in front of the School Ethics Commission is dismissed because people don't read this. They read the first part, they read what the statute says, but they don't look at what the evidence of the violation is, right? So everyone who thinks that the school board has done something wrong will run to school ethics, file an ethics charge, hey, they didn't follow the law. But in order to actually establish a violation of this part of the code, you have to actually have a judicial, like a court order or an administrative agency decision saying that you did in fact failed to follow the law. So I always point this out in subsection A because it's one of the ones that people file charges under often, and it's one of the hardest ones to prove. You can go ahead. So case note under this subsection was the Pleasantville Board of Education. So when you see on the top left corner where it says C58-21, so that's the School Ethics Commission docket number. Anything that starts with a C is a case that's actually been adjudicated. Anything that starts with an A is an advisory opinion. So you can actually ask the School Ethics Commission for an opinion on whether something might be in conflict with your duties as a board member. And if they have not already issued a public advisory opinion on it, they will give you that guidance. So that's a really helpful tool that we use a lot when we're kind of, working through these issues. So this was an interesting case. Board members there's a ethics charge filed against board members. What happened, I may or may not have been at this meeting, I don't know. But what happened was there was a vote, there were a couple ethics charges actually. There was a motion, there was a vote to suspend the superintendent, to fire the superintendent. There was basically the attempt to make action, to take adverse action against the superintendent's employment. There was no rights notice given, and it was done in public. There was, no executive session discussion beforehand. And I think justifiably, people were concerned that that violated the law. There were a number of ethics complaints filed as a result of a couple questionable issues that came up. And although they seem manifestly clear that there was a violation of the law, right? I mean, every attorney I'm sure who's ever talked to about, being a board of education, what a rights notice is, that you've got to do that before you can talk about an employee. Seemed very clear, but the School Ethics Commission said this is not yet a violation of the Code of Ethics because we don't have a determination from a judge, from an administrative agency, from someone telling us that the law has in fact been violated. So what we take from that is that someone's opinion is not enough. Someone's opinion that you violated the law is not enough to establish a violation of the Code of Ethics, at least under subsection A. So that's how the code kind of unfolds. That's how you'll see the slideshow go, but I'm mostly going to skip over the evidence of the violation. You guys can all have copies of the presentation. Look at it anytime you need to. That's sort of the less interesting part, but I just want you to know kind of how it goes.
So someone in the meeting made a motion to remove.
The board member,
A
yep.
board member made a motion to remove the superintendent for something, and they said there was no court order saying that there was a violation,
So the
therefore.
superintendent, so a couple different people brought ethics charges, but one of them being the superintendent, brought ethics charges against some of the board members saying, you tried to take action against me. You did not give me a rights notice. You did not give me any indication that my employment would be discussed before the Board of Education, which seems like a pretty clear violation of that particular right. When charges were brought under the Code of Ethics, what the School Ethics Commission said is we're going to dismiss this because we don't have proof of the violation, because proof of violation means an actual court order or decision from an administrative agency. So it's just really hard to establish a violation under this part of the code.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I'm geeking out here, but so what should this person who
Great
alleged
question.
an ethics violation
Great
have
question.
done to?
I don't actually know. No, I've always wondered that because the school ethics. So here's what I think. I think what that person needs to do is also file in Superior Court
Right.
or whatever the proper agency is.
Right.
Because when you file in front of the School Ethics Commission, you have to verify that the matter isn't pending anywhere else.
Okay.
So I think they have to file. What I would what I would probably do is file and then file the ethics charge and have the school ethics commission either tell me, file after you're done, or we hold it in abeyance, because
Yeah.
there is a 180-day statute of limitations. You have to bring these pretty quickly. So, I mean, like we could be in court for a couple years before you actually have a determination. It's 180 days from when you should have known there was a violation. So it's not clear to me, whether that's when you've actually filed in Superior Court or when you've actually reached had an adjudication of it. But it's a great question. Okay, you can go ahead. All right, subsection B, I'll make decisions in terms of the educational welfare of children and will seek to develop and maintain schools that meet the individual needs of all children, regardless of their ability, race, creed, sex, or social standing, right? All well and good, sounds great, totally the North Star of what we're doing here. You can go ahead. This is your evidence of the violation. You take a quick look at it, nothing particularly interesting there. But you have to provide evidence that the board member who you're trying to file an ethics charge against willfully made a decision contrary to the educational welfare of children. So a couple cases that shows you how this plays out. C-3620, that's the first one up there. Board president raised concerns to the principal and the superintendent about their child's teacher and later filed an HIB complaint against that teacher. They did not violate this provision, even though that staff member ended up not being renewed. The comments made and the HIB complaint were made in the capacity as a parent, and the decision to non-renew lies solely with the superintendent. So just, complaining about a teacher, even taking action potentially in that situation wasn't a violation of the code of ethics. The second one is a little bit more demonstrative, I think. So a board member was found to be in violation of the code when he released an ethics complaint that had been filed against another board member. He released that to the media, and that ethics complaint contained confidential information about the other board member's child, who was a student. So, it's a little bit of a roundabout way to get there, but releasing that complaint to the public, disclosed confidential student information, not a decision made, with the educational welfare of children in mind. Okay, go ahead. Subsection C, this one's probably the most important one in terms of governance, right? Your role here is to be models of good governance. You'll hear me and everyone else say your job is policymaking, planning, and appraisal. Okay, P, and A. That is the board's purview. I will help to frame policies and plans only after the board has consulted those who will be affected by them. That's the second part of it. So we make policy, and we make good policy because we check in with the folks who are going to be impacted by the policy. Go ahead. Evidence of the violation is that you, board member, took action to effectuate policies and plans without that consultation, or took action unrelated to these three things, which really speak to the high level governing of the district. So developing the general rules and principles that guide the management of the district, formulating programs and methods to effectuate the goals, or ascertaining the value or reliability of a policy. So all three of those things speak to what is within the purview of the board. So taking action outside of that is where you can get in trouble. And this is one of the places where it's not necessarily intuitive, right? You're asked to make big, important decisions, and the instinct is to want to know every little step that got you there. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, as a board member, is you have to learn how to adjust to the governance structure of the board, the committee structure, everything flowing through the superintendent, and you have to learn and you trust. It's difficult. It's very difficult. Not that Dr. Hackett is untrustworthy, but it's difficult for any Board of Education member to make these big decisions that people are going to then come and, have something to say about and feel like, you're leaving some of that in someone else's hands. But that is what you signed up for. So let's see what that looks like in practice. So, okay, board members conducted a site visit to assess a candidate for the assistant superintendent position without board authority. That conduct was outside the scope of a board member's authority, okay? Because the assistant superintendent only gets hired at the recommendation of the superintendent. It is not the board's purview to go and do site visits and assess a candidate. Now, the board might have a little bit more involvement in hiring an assistant superintendent because it is a very high level position, but, not much. not much more.
So I was gonna ask you, could you be more specific? Like what, because that is the hardest. This is the hardest.
It is, yeah.
So what type of involvement do you think is appropriate in a, something like that, hiring of?
Yeah, so I think that for any hire, I think what the board's purview is, what is the process in place, right? Is there a process and are we following it? And are we following it consistently? And that process might look different for different positions, right? For a bus driver or for a classroom teacher, that process might not be quite as expansive as what you guys have probably gone through hiring a superintendent, right? Which is a multi-month process. But is there a process and what is it and who's involved? Are there stakeholder voices involved? I think it's fair game to say, what's the process, right? How did it go? And listen, there's questions you can ask out of curiosity, like, did we get a lot of candidates? What are, I'm okay with you guys asking those questions. I'm not okay with, can I see the resumes? Why do we, why this person, not that person, right? If you want to, like, it's absolutely within your purview to know who the candidate is, what their credentials are, all those sorts of things, but not really to second guess what decisions were made in the process. Was there a process? Was it followed? Are we comfortable with the process? If that process should look different, I think it's okay for that to be, somewhat of a board discussion. Are we advertising in all the right places? Are we pulling from an expansive enough candidate pool? It's okay to want to know about the candidate, but that's pretty much it.
And
Go ahead.
Are those processes, do they have to be documented anywhere? Or are they just like, this is pattern and practice, this is what we do and we follow it for this particular position?
Yeah, I don't think that has to be necessarily codified in policy. There's some stuff that's going to, that might already be in your contracts, like about posting, right? Like posting positions, making sure that, they're posted for a certain amount of time. Those are fairly common. Those are like just common across education. They're also, I don't know if it's in your contract, but those are fairly common contract provisions. I don't think it needs to be codified, but I think it's good to know that there is a process. And I mean, listen, hiring these days is, you have to be fluid, because hiring now in particular, I would call it difficult, Dr. Ag, is that the right word? Challenging. It does vary. There are some market fluctuations that impact it. So there's sometimes you're going to have to move faster, or maybe you're truncating a process, and then there's other times where it might be a little bit longer. But I don't feel strongly that it needs to be documented, but I think you should know what it is. And I think it's okay to ask what that process is. I think it's important to know, like, if you guys have, diversity and equity goals in terms of your staff and representation on your staff, where are we posting? What efforts are we making to, build our pipeline of teachers and that sort of thing? I think it's okay to want to know that and to, if that's one of the board's goals, but, it doesn't have to be, it's not like a sort of checklist circumscribed kind of a thing.
Thanks.
Do you think it's ever appropriate for a representative of the board to serve on an interview committee for a top tier hire?
So great question. Spoiler alert, I do answer that later in the presentation, but the answer is no. And that's not my opinion. That's the School Ethics Commission's opinion.
Okay.
So I believe it's in here. We'll touch on it later, but there's an advisory opinion where they say, like, they don't even support the existence of like an HR committee, which I think is a little impractical. There's other HR issues, there's other personnel issues that aren't just interviewing, right? That I think are important for, the board is involved in. But that's very clear in this advisory opinion. They do not support board members participating in or even sitting in on interviews for any position on other than the superintendent, which is your hire.
Yep. Okay.
So basically that's exactly what I was just going to say or ask. Pretty much when we were hiring a superintendent, the process was very different. We did do the interviews. So,
Yep.
But what you're saying is once that superintendent is put in place, that authority, anyone under the superintendent authority is taken away from us.
Yeah, or whether or not you have a
We never had
superintendent.
it. We
Yeah,
never had
exactly.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll hear folks from school boards say the board has one employee and it's the superintendent. That doesn't really make sense. They're all employees of the board, but the analogy makes sense. That's the person who you guys have direct supervisory authority over, right? That's the only person who you review, right? You evaluate the superintendent, you don't evaluate anybody else. And the superintendent is who all of the personnel recommendations come through.
So superintendent has discretion to share biographical information of potential hires. And I mean, I'm speaking specifically about,
I would say candidates, not like, I wouldn't say here's candidates A, B, and C. I would say, here's who we're hiring, here's who's I'm going to recommend. Here's all the information I want you to know about.
gotcha.
And listen, and especially these days, and I don't know how it's happening here. I'm just talking generally what I'm seeing across clients. Like, you are seeing more guide consideration being given to new hires because it's very difficult to hire people. So if your contract allows it, people are getting advanced some steps. That's something that I'm seeing more superintendents being like, hey, just as an FYI, this is why I'm doing this. Is all the years of experience they have. Like, so there's, you're being asked to vote on that. It's okay to want that information, but it's really information about the successful candidate, which is what you're getting.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that the best advice I've ever heard on this is, when you're thinking about asking a question, right? I think that what you have to ask yourself is, what action is the board being asked to take such that I need this information, right? Is this curiosity? Is this, beyond? Is this even something that's coming before the board? So I think that's kind of a good guideline. Like, what action are we being asked to take? What do I need this information for? What question, right? What am I being asked to answer that I need this information for? You guys work through a committee system, right? So I always say, and this also comes later, I talk a little bit about just like sort of boardsmanship stuff that makes some of these things go easier. And I think it's a board level discussion, but the superintendent, the business administrator, the board president, and I also think committee chairs are your resources, right, for questions. And so within those 4 people, right, there's 3 specific people and then a category, right, of committee chairs. I think that's where information comes from, because committees bring recommendations forward to the board. So if there's a particular question you have under policy, right, it makes sense to me, go to the policy committee chair. They might be able to answer some questions. Maybe that takes some traffic off Dr. Hackett's desk. I know she's always happy to, answer questions from board members, but, it's always good to just sort of be aware of those resources. So, and I think that's also something that you guys as a board can decide what makes the most sense, in terms of how you want that information to flow. But generally speaking, that's where I would go. Yeah. So if you're asking a question about something that isn't on an agenda, right? I mean, that's probably not the best. So it may or may not be something that's coming up. Yeah, and listen, I would say, like, and I don't like there to be this like, no, you can't ask questions if it's not literally coming up on the next board agenda. But there's also a management of resources here, right? You want to be mindful of, if there isn't something imminently coming up, if there isn't a discussion that the question, that needs to be informed by that information, is this how we want to use the time and resources? So and listen, you're going to get it wrong sometimes, right? You're going to get it right for the most part, but you're going to get it wrong sometimes. And sometimes it's going to go too far. You learn as a board member. None of this sends you to board member jail. This is all about learning. And it's all about sort of adjusting to the parameters of the role. So if you find yourself doubting, I would say ask someone. If you're concerned, like, am I getting too far into the weeds here? Am I taking up too much of someone's time? Just ask, is this beyond what, I need to know? All right, where do we leave off? All right, let's go. Subsection D.
I don't think you went through those examples.
I didn't? Wait, go back. Oh, no, I did. You're right. I went through the first one, the second one.
Yeah.
Right, this was C. Okay, the second one's actually important. If you could you go back one, Bruce? Yep. There it is. So the second one is an advisory opinion on volunteering. I always put this in there because it's really interesting. So obviously you guys are board members making the big $0 here, okay? So the one thing, this is my gift to you, or rather the School Ethics Commission's gift to you, okay? Volunteering as a board, like when you're a board member, even though you're a parent, is a lot of times off the table. If you need to get yourselves out of any requests for volunteering, you can point to this. So under this subsection of the code, limiting your actions to policymaking, planning, and appraisal, there are a number of advisory opinions where the School Ethics Commission has weighed in and said it would create the appearance that you are not confining your actions to policymaking, planning, and appraisal if, for instance, in this particular situation, it was a I believe it was a theater production. Someone wanted to volunteer to do the costumes or the music or something like that. It was a board member. They solicited an advisory opinion, and the School Ethics Commission's like, well, you'd be directing students, you'd be taking direction from staff, you'd potentially be directing staff. You can't just completely take off your board member hat and say, I'm just here as a parent tonight. It doesn't really work that way. There's still that appearance. So there are certain volunteer, like these sort of long-term habitual volunteer projects are things that the School Ethics Commission has said you shouldn't be doing. PTAs are still okay to some extent. They have they have a standalone advisory opinion on like the treasurer, the president, and all it kind of depends on what level of interaction you have with school staff and with students. Like they kind of seem to say you can be the treasurer of the PTA because you have nothing to do with anyone in the district. You're just keeping the books. But so they really look at the degree of interaction that you're having with staff and with students and the potential that exists there for, making it seem like you're not limiting your board role. If you want to go on a class trip, that's fine. You can chaperone a class trip, you can chaperone a dance. Like these one-offs, I tend to think are not that much of a concern. It's these sort of more long-term ones.
So serving on Dr. Hackett's committees, for example, would be like an NO no.
I mean, it's
No, it's interesting. This one surprised. I mean,
it's one of the ones where I always say it's not intuitive, right?
No.
You guys fundamentally are volunteers here giving your time.
well, and we're also parents with kids in the district.
Right.
So this
Yeah.
is interesting.
Yeah. So those get a little bit stickier, right? It kind of depends on what you do in that role. And I always say, like, listen, if you're not sure, let's get an advisory opinion. Let's ask them the question. It really depends on the extent, and I don't have a great sense. That varies from school to school, what those roles look like. I feel comfortable saying like you're one off, I'm going to chaperone this trip or this dance, like that's all okay. The more long-term stuff is where it gets a little bit more difficult. These people, like staff looks at you as like, oh, this is a member of the board. Like it's a little bit intimidating for them. I don't know what Dr. Hackett's committees are, so I'd have to know more about that one specifically. But, if it feels wrong to you, just,
Yeah.
have the time for it.
Well, and it definitely blurs the line.
Mhm.
And I know as a practice, at least since I've served on the board, we've said, because people have asked for people not to serve on PFAs, not to be class parents, because
Yeah.
it is too
Yeah.
boring. But yes, the like one-offs would be fine, but we've tried to go more restrictive because because teachers don't feel, at least we've gotten the feedback that they don't feel comfortable.
No, and I think that's important to know. I think that's important to know. If it's an experience you really want to have with your kid, go to the zoo, whatever, great. But that other, I think it is important to be mindful of that. And it was only in the last couple years that they issued the advisory opinion clarifying some specifics on like these these homeschool associations. And I don't know that it gave me a ton of clarity, but it really does. It's really about the degree of interaction with staff and students.
So I did know that as far as the fundraising piece of it. There's been many times even through middle school where I've been asked, oh, can you fundraise for this? Or no, I can't because I'm on the board of ed, so I can't do that. So I knew about that part. For a quick minute when my son was going to be in theater and before he decided not to, I did want to volunteer and help out to maybe make the costumes or do something like that, but then he quit. Here's my question. Something like Teacher Appreciation Week that is coming up. They're asking for donations, gift cards, things like that. Are we allowed to donate something like that?
I mean, listen, I don't have an issue with that. It doesn't implicate this section of the code, right? You're not in there, telling teachers what to do or supervising students or anything like that. If you're just making a donation, that's perfectly fine.
Or like, for example, I would be giving gift cards on
Yeah, it's
behalf
an
of my
event,
husband's business. It's not, so he's my husband, it's his business, but it's not really me. So I thought it would be okay.
It's a donation though, right?
Yeah, it's a donation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's okay.
As a parent, right? You mean like your classroom teachers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in the code of ethics that says you can't do that. I mean, I think there's probably board policies on teachers accepting gifts. I'm pretty sure there's a Strauss Esme policy that says they're not supposed to, but
No
I'm not
wine.
gonna ruin anyone's fun.
No wine bottles, no the last day of school, no.
All right, are we good? Can I,
Yeah.
okay, go ahead. Okay, this sort of goes hand in hand with policy making. I'll carry out my responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with my fellow board members to see that they are well run. Okay, so this is the no micromanaging principle here. Evidence of the violation is that the board member gave a direct order to school personnel or became directly involved in activities or functions that are the responsibility of school personnel or the day-to-day administration. So, I have at least one slide on this. I might have two because there's a lot that come under these. So the first one I thought was actually kind of interesting. I like this one, Monroe Township. So there's a board member who was concerned about someone's conduct. I'm assuming it was a parent at a sporting event. They then asked to be on the policy committee and sort of spearheaded efforts to create a disorder, like a spectator policy. And this person brought ethics charges against that board member, and the School Ethics Commission was like, actually, that's exactly what you're supposed to do, right? This was 100% fine. You addressed a concern through policy, which is the purview of the board. The fact that it was sort of colored by this person's personal experience, and maybe there was beef, I don't know, but this was still the right way to do it. So I thought that was interesting. The other one, the second one up there, C4010, board member was censured because they instructed the superintendent to allow a particular student to participate in graduation exercises. They basically gave the superintendent an order related to the day-to-day administration of the district. Turns out there was a very good reason for the student to not be participating in graduation ceremonies. There were specific safety concerns that the police were involved in, and there were threats that the student was the target of a shooting. The board member, by the way, was aware of that report, and nonetheless still was sort of trying to assert their will here. Obviously, there were good reasons behind what the superintendent did, and even if the board member disagreed, that is a superintendent's decision to make, not the board's.
Well, can one person on the board even direct?
They
the
can
ethics?
try. They do it all the time.
Yeah.
But no, they absolutely cannot, which gets at my favorite slide that's coming up. You'll know it when you see it. You can go ahead.
Well, and it's not just the superintendent, it's our staff as well. Like you're not allowed-
Absolutely,
which
yeah.
I will tell you has happened on more than 10 occasions.
Yeah.
That we've found out that board members have either told principals or teachers to do something instead of following the correct chain of command. And so this is another area where people.
Yeah, and if you go, all right, so he did change the slide, yeah, though, and it's right there, right? So I knew there were two slides on this. So there's a board member, visited the school, took pictures of open windows in the bathroom, items of concern, and then spoke to the media about it instead of talking to the superintendent. Listen, if you're picking your kid up and if you notice something, let Dr. Hackett know, right? You don't pull the custodian aside and say, hey, can you fix that? Or, I mean, that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky for you guys as board members. So that was a pretty clear-cut example. And then here's the other one. Board member would violate the act by this is an advisory opinion, participating in an exit interview or even observing the exit interview, which would breach the board member's obligation to refrain from becoming directly involved in activities that are the responsibility of school personnel and micromanaging school personnel. So there's an advisory opinion on exit interviews and also on personnel committees. So that's the one that we have in here. All right. Yep. And listen, parents do that all the time. You're not just a parent anymore. It takes on a different, yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, no, it's the appropriate way for the chain of, and listen, I mean, if there's an immediate safety issue, do what you have to do, right? Like that's a different situation. But if it's just that doesn't seem right, That goes right to the superintendent.
Hmm.
So to the point of the question, can one board member, right, direct? The answer is subsection E. I will recognize that authority rests with the Board of Education and will make no personal promises nor take any private action that may compromise the board. This is my favorite part of the presentation, okay? All right, go ahead. This is the big reveal. Anyone know what this is? Anyone know what we're looking at here? That's right. Okay, go on next, right? All right, so Mr. Bryce, take us through this. Explain Voltron here.
You know what? My kids, we form Voltron. That's our text message.
Awesome.
All the pieces make the robot.
Well,
Amen, sister.
yeah, individually, they're great, but as they come together, they're even greater.
Yes, so you get it. This is my favorite slide. This is my favorite. I do this every year. It's like my favorite part of the presentation. So you can go one more. There we go. There's Voltron, defender of the universe. Now, like all the little space line robots who make up Voltron are cool in their own right, but they are not Voltron. Okay, this is Voltron. So this is your analogy. Okay, this is who you guys are. But in case we need more examples, more dated cultural references to make the point. Okay. You are Destiny's Child. You are not Beyonce. You are, I know, it's tough. That's tough.
That one is tough today.
You are Queen. No one is Freddie Mercury. And of course, you
Oh.
are the Beatles, not John Lennon. So that concludes the dated cultural references portion of my presentation. I got to tell you, there's always one person who gets Voltron, and like that. Yeah, it's like, and it's only ever one, right? And it's like a 5-year age range, and they're like Voltron. I'm like, yes. You know, it's a very specific one. Yeah. So I always feel really good about. Thank you. You just made my night. Okay. So, but you get the point. You are the board is one group. You guys all ran for the board. Okay. You all signed up to play in the band. You got to play the same song. Okay. No solo acts. So that's my nice little analogy here. But so let's see what this looks like in practice. You can go ahead. So this is our evidence of a violation. This one's sort of one of the more amorphous sections, like made personal promises or took action beyond the scope of their duties, such that by its nature had the potential to compromise the board. Couple good, you can go ahead, couple good examples here under the case notes. So the first one, this was related to the earlier one we saw about visiting, doing a site visit for an assistant superintendent. These board members violated the code and were censured when they made personal promises to a candidate for assistant superintendent by basically saying like advancing the possibility of their employment with the district and trying to resolve a contract issue. So a couple board members who were really interested in this candidate were like, hey, listen, we're going to get you in. We'll clear up this contract thing that was going on. It's fine. You know, now, for all I know, that assistant superintendent could have relied on that promise made by a couple board members and not taken other jobs or relocated or something like that. Nobody individually gets to make those promises. So that's one way, right, that you can get into trouble. This is sort of the other end of the spectrum. Board member, this one just cracks me up, was found in violation, suspended for 6 months when during a traffic stop. Okay, she identified herself as a board member, insulted the officer, you know, called the request for a license and registration, you know, bleeping insult, threatened to make a call right now to the council president. Meanwhile, like, does this really give you guys that much? Like, do you know who I am? Like, I am on the Board of Education, sir. Right? Like, I can park wherever I want.
They'd be like, where's that? What's that?
Exactly.
What is
You know
that?
what I mean, right?
Has
Sure.
No power.
I
Yeah.
volunteer for this position.
That's right.
Better listen.
That's right. Yeah.
So can you talk, so we have had, at least we've had emails come through over the course, again, over the last 5-6 years, whatever it is, of children of board members making comments to teachers such that something along the lines of, you better give me what I want, or I better not get in trouble. My parent is a board member.
I think the
Can you talk-
FCC needs to ground those kids, right?
We'll talk about the discipline, yeah.
Right.
But like clearly clearly a violation, even though it's not the board member acting.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a concern, right? And I think that, were that to happen, and listen, like I said, there's places you can trip over the code of ethics. This isn't intuitive. So I would give everyone the benefit of the doubt in that situation, but it's a talking to, right? It's a conversation that's made clear that you got to talk to your kid. You got to make sure they're not saying this. And also I assume they're not hearing this at home, right? Because that of course is the concern, right? That they're hearing it, the parents say, have at it, I'm a board member now, it's all good. We own this place.
Right.
Oh, we're not supposed to say that?
All right, you can go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Recommend them how? So I think that would be a little bit of a concern because you're essentially asking for input into a hiring decision that's not within the board's purview. I think you can say, and listen, right now in this moment, like if you know any language teachers or special education teachers, if forget what I said, just call Dr. Hackett, right? We'll get them in tomorrow.
But you can tell your friend to apply.
Right, exactly.
Like
Yeah.
you just can't recommend them.
Yeah.
And then you should
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's fine for you to tell them to
Yeah,
apply, but then
that part
I
is
also
absolutely
think you
fine.
need to disclose
Yeah.
to the board that this is your friend.
Well, and I also,
Yeah. Correct. Of course, you have to.
well, and I also, not only can you, but I think you should be encouraging people to apply in the
Right,
district,
right,
right?
of course.
Like, yeah, 100%, right. Right, I wouldn't be like, yeah, what you wouldn't want to do is say to your friend, I'll send your resume directly to Dr.
Right.
Right? What you can do is say, like, go on Frontline, it would be under this section, right? Like, I mean, listen, probably not, Listen, if someone uses you as a reference, honestly, like I don't want to ruin anyone's like chances. Like if you have something to say about them, like it's up to Dr. Hackett how she wants to handle that. I think it would probably be better for them to use someone else just because it's, but if it's someone new or, they only have a couple of references, it's not on you that they put you down as a reference. And then Dr. Hackett would just have to decide how to handle that. Okay. All right, subsection F, I'll refuse to surrender my independent judgment to special interest, partisan political groups or to use the schools for personal gain or for the gain of friends. Go ahead. Interesting evidence of a violation here, like it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. Took action on behalf of or at the request of a special interest group or persons organized and voluntary united in opinion who would, right, you can read the whole thing. I'm not going to read it. Like even within that, I'll tell you, this one confuses me a little bit because you could have a group of people who come to the board and say, hey, we think this needs to be addressed, right? And the board might decide to take action on it. So like, this is more about, I think when you're taking action personally, or whether it's, again, without consulting those who were, impacted by policies. So don't get too hung up on the language here. You'll see where it, where the rubber meets the road on this one. You can go ahead. Okay, so the first one here, file this under my constant refrain. This stuff is not intuitive. So as a board member who had owned and operated a business and previously did like a 50-50 fundraiser, right? Like it's Voorhees night at the Chick-fil-A, right? And then Mr. Chick-fil-A comes and gets elected to the board, can no longer run that fundraiser because that was a profit splitting. So now as a board member, you're kind of generating income. So really nice thing, something that was good for the community, but once you're a board member, takes on a different tone. Okay, so the second one, this was an advisory opinion. I gotta tell you, this is another one of my favorite ones because this is like someone who really knows how to play the long game when it comes to being spiteful. There's something about it you just can't help but admire. A board member, someone got themselves elected to the board. They were previously employed in the district, terminated by the superintendent, filed ethics charges against the superintendent, and then their first act upon being elected was calling for a vote of no confidence in the superintendent.
That's terrible.
Yeah, but like I said, someone's really playing the long game there, So, fortunately, this was an advisory opinion rather than an actual case. Someone was able to put the brakes on that and say, why don't we just go ahead and ask the School Ethics Commission about that? School Ethics Commission weighed in and say, yes, that would be a problem. But also, because of your history with the superintendent, you also cannot vote on matters involving the superintendent, evaluate the superintendent, and be involved in those personnel decisions. So this person kind of talked themselves out of the very mission that they were pursuing all of those years as like an origin story. But that's where it ended up. Now, an interesting point here on the conflict of interest provisions, we're talking about the Code of Ethics here. Separately under the School Ethics Act are conflict provisions, which are some things I know that have been a topic of discussion amongst the board. I do talk about that in a later slide, just give you some examples of those. But when it comes to participating in personnel matters involving the superintendents, one of the places where there can be a conflict other than this is if you have an immediate family member or relative employed in district. So we'll talk about that, but just as a sort of side issue apart from the code, but under the act.
So personal gain, and this may be more appropriate under conflict of interest, but obviously we all have other lives, other jobs. Does it only mean by personal gain, a financial gain? Or for instance, if I sit on a board separate from this board, let's say I sit on the Federation, the Jewish Federation board. If I want to have, the Federation has a great speaker coming up, and I use my role as a board member to say, Dr. Hackett, it would be great if this speaker came and spoke to our classrooms. I think that's inappropriate, but where does that fall?
So
Because I'm not financially getting it.
Yeah. So it's both of those things, like both aspects of that can be problematic. So under the conflict of interest provisions, and let me check. I think I might have listed them in here, like, just so you guys had them in one place. Yeah, I think I do have all of them. So we'll go through them pretty quickly, but under the conflict of interest provisions under the School Ethics Act, you're not supposed to act in a manner like where you, a relative or an other is what they're called, has an interest. So, and where interest is actually defined as a financial interest, but then there's also a part where it talks about unwarranted privileges or some sort of personal gain. So there's a conflict of interest provision for some sort of personal gain, whether it's credibility, sort of professional appreciation, other than money, right? Gain loosely under the conflict of interest provisions, but then it's sort of separate under the Code of Ethics in terms of overstepping, I think. So I think it's okay to say, hey, you were talking about the 8th graders doing this project. I was just over it, like as a board member over here, they have this really interesting thing going on. Here's some information, take a look, maybe pass along to the principal. If it's something they're interested in, it's just a resource. Like, you can share information about resources that you guys know as community members or even that you participate in. It's where you don't want to be too heavy-handed and make it feel like you're directing the superintendent. So I would say, you've got to use your judgment, right? This could be interesting. And it's about approach too. Maybe look at this, or, hey, I know that you guys were looking at this. This is what I heard these people were doing, right? You guys can certainly offer that kind of feedback. You just have to be careful about staying in your lane. Okay. All right. Confidentiality. This one's fairly straightforward. Holding confidential on matters pertaining to the schools. We can go through this one pretty quickly. Again, evidence of the violation has to be pretty specific, that you took action to disclose something that was confidential. The other part of this is not just holding confidential, but also communicating accurate information. I always gloss over that, but it's a very important piece of it. So you've got to hold confidential on matters pertaining to the schools, but also in conjunction with your fellow board members, convey accurate information. And so we'll see that under the case notes. You can go ahead. So to social media, just sort of another cautionary tale about social media. So these are 2 cases, both of which arise under some social media mishap. A board member was censured for responding to and having a social media message reposted over an alleged student discipline incident. This actually wasn't a social media message is the right word. It was like a family thread inside an app, I forget which, where a board member was on a text thread, for lack of a better term, or a DM thread with other members of their family, where they commented on a student discipline matter involving the school, disclosed some specific information, the school, the grade level, and some information about the discipline imposed. It wasn't, and then someone in that thread then posted it. So I've had to say to teachers before when I've been, when I do professional development for staff, and I always say to board members, like, there's no spousal privilege privilege in this, right? Like, that's not a thing where like, I know I can't tell anyone, but I can tell my husband, right? Like, nope, nope, like all of this stays confidential. The other one, this was actually, this was a little bit more innocent. So you see in that top one, C1718, that board member was censured. That's a higher penalty than reprimand. In the one underneath it, that board member was reprimanded. What happened here was there was an executive session discussion about an issue. That was sort of derived from a parent complaint. After that executive session discussion, a parent emailed the whole board and said, hey, I want to follow up on this. What are you guys doing about it? And then a board member replied all, forgot to take the parent off, and like replied all and said like, well, further to what we discussed in executive session, or something like that. Like it was a reply all faux pas, but it's one of the reasons why you're always hearing do not reply all. In addition to the confidentiality issue, there's also a potential Open Public Meetings Act issue, right? You're sort of deliberating via email as a quorum.
That's why I BCC you all, so that nobody can do it.
Yep.
Because I've done it before. So
Yep.
instead of,
Yeah, right, because you can't reply all then.
right, exactly.
I can go ahead. Okay, so this is personnel specific. I'll vote to appoint the best qualified personnel available after consideration of the recommendation of the chief administrative officer. Okay, so your job is to vote for the best qualified person and consider the superintendent's recommendation. Go ahead. You can just skip the next one. So where you see this come into practice under the case notes. So the first one, board members don't violate the code if they don't appoint, if they vote not to reappoint an employee who the superintendent has recommended, as long as, even though you're going against the recommendation, as long as it's not arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable. Basically, that's the standard. So as long as you've considered the superintendent's recommendation, you don't necessarily violate the code of ethics if you do not agree with it. I strongly recommend against doing that. I think that that's always a big, ugly scene. And those are conversations that should be had and actions that shouldn't be taken lightly, but it's not a violation of the code of ethics.
Could you give an example of what would be considered arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable?
I don't like his face. That was my grandfather's thing. I don't like his face. Yeah, can't do it. Not a reason. In the private sector, it might be, but not in this context. But it's generally without any basis, right? And it's usually sometimes it's for personal reason, for a reason of political affiliation. You've seen some of those cases where it's just for a reason unrelated to the actual qualifications. Here's your other advisory opinion on personnel. School Ethics Commission does not support board members conducting interviews for positions under the superintendent. So the functioning of a personnel committee in any capacity invites the danger that board members may violate their obligations, but they don't even want you to have a personnel committee. Most boards do. You find a way, it's fine. There are other personnel issues that are fair game to discuss. Go ahead. This one's very important. I will support and protect school personnel and the proper performance of their duties. If you want to talk badly about Dr. Hackett or any of her staff, you have lost the privilege of doing that on the board, right? If you want to be a keyboard warrior and rant on Facebook, you have lost the ability to do that while being on the board. That time is over. That time of your life is over. Sorry. You can go ahead. And you will see that's exactly where you can keep going, where people get into trouble here. So the first one up there, pretty straightforward. Board member violated the codes when he sent a letter to the superintendent, copied the president of the State Board of Education, the executive county superintendent, basically accusing the superintendent of letting employees violate board policy. That was something public, went outside the district. The second one is, actually there's a couple under here. C0118 Avalon Stone Harbor board member violated the code. So they basically went to a district employee and were like, hey, if the superintendent position were to open up, what do you think? Would you be interested? Basically sort of hinting at the fact we're going to fire the superintendent. And, so in light of the fact that the position wasn't vacant, there was no position to fill, and then that employee was the current superintendent's subordinate, this was viewed as being, as not supporting school personnel in the performance of their duties. You can go ahead. This is one of the more recent ones. So this came up in the context of an election. So what happened here was a board member shared something that someone else had posted. And the other person was running for the board, and they were posting about their opponent who they were running against, and was like, well, when she worked at the high school, they had to walk her out in handcuffs, right? Something like that. The board member who had endorsed this person who was running reshared that on her Facebook page, and it was inaccurate. It was inaccurate information. That person was, I think that person was like a former substitute in district, and there was nothing disciplinary about why that person was no longer subbing in district. But as a board member, sharing that information sort of gives it the imprimatur of accuracy, right? You're the president of the board, and so it caused needless injury, and also failed to support at least a former staff member.
So on this one, I'm going to ask a very specific question because, and we did it last year too. We're coming off of, and because it's an easier example, we're coming off of COVID. But during COVID, the board had to take specific positions with regards to face coverings, with regards to lots of different things. Is it or is it not appropriate for a board member to, because that's a very personal position, is it appropriate for a board member to then go on social media, take a personal position against whatever the board position was? So we had face coverings in school. Would it be okay if I got online and said, face coverings are the worst, they're not safe, they give you whatever the people that came to the board meeting said, they give you, your teeth will fall out, whatever they said. Is that appropriate or is that not appropriate?
So I think it actually depends on the content, right? If you go on social media and say, I think these are doing, like, I hate face coverings. I don't agree with the science behind it, but you know what? It's the law, and this is what we're following because we're a school district and we follow the law. I could probably live with that.
That's definitely not.
Yeah.
That's not what it was.
If I got on and was like, COVID's not really a thing.
Yeah. I mean, listen, some
Right.
things are protected, but I think to the extent that you're suggesting that the school district is doing something illegal, harmful, inappropriate, not good for kids, I think saying that as a board member is problematic because that's what has the potential to compromise the board. If you're out
But
there
how does a
saying,
cause of action arise from that? So somebody would have to file an ethics.
Yes.
Complaint. Could a board member file an?
anyone can file an ethics complaint. Yep. Can be a board member. It can be two board members. It can be a member of the public. It can be several members of the public. It could be the president of your teachers association. It could be the spouse of the superintendent. It can be anyone. And it often is. So.
And do you find though that boards in a situation like that, which I know what the situation is, but can boards like talk about that and say like, hey, and come to an agreement about how to conduct themselves? I mean,
in terms of social media or like have a conversation with that employee?
I'm talking about social media specifically.
Stay off it. There you go. I fixed it. Just avoid it.
Just saying I'm a board member or disclosing you're a board member at all.
Yeah.
Because I have done that before.
Yeah.
Like,
listen, and so I'm being glib about it, right? I don't like, it's not realistic to just be like, don't go on social media.
Right.
It's not realistic. But it's also not realistic to just expect that like if you give a disclaimer, you can say anything, right? Speaking personally, I think Dr. Hackett's the worst, right? Like not as a board president, right? Like that's not gonna fly, right? No one's gonna think that like, and listen, and I have seen board members like they'll post like, hey, we're hiring Facebook network, like I don't think you have to be totally like, abstain totally. You just have to be very careful. I think engaging with people in debate when you are a member of the board is really tough. When you're supporting the board's position, like if you're sort of explaining what this executive order means. Like we saw a lot of that. We really did. I mean, during the pandemic, there was a lot of that and it was hard to avoid. And it's also hard to sit here and not be able to explain yourselves, right? It's a very difficult position to be in. So what I always say is like, tread lightly. If you hesitate, you probably shouldn't do it, And if you have any questions, call me. like, it comes up a lot during election season, endorsing other candidates, that sort of, like, all of these things are, like, they're gray, they're sticky, and a lot of times the devil's in the details. So when it comes to ethics, if you have a question, I always say, talk to the board president. She'll get you in touch with me. It's one of the few things that I do encourage, like, pretty free access to counsel on, because, like, I don't want anyone to feel like they're on an island and have to make a decision about whether they're gonna do something that could violate the code of ethics without getting some insight on that.
The support district personnel. So I have two daughters. My older one is much harder and she's not in the district anymore. Thank you. She's in high school. But when she was younger, there were times when I had to interface with her teachers and it wasn't always pleasant.
Mhm.
How do you do that as a board member?
Yeah, so you're clearly in your role as a parent when you're dealing with your kid's teacher. Even in the conflict of interest section of the School Ethics Act, you can't bring a cause of action against the board, but you can advocate for your own child. The School Ethics Commission, I think everyone generally recognizes that board members are often parents, so there is this sort of duality in what you're doing. I think you just have to be clear. And if it makes you feel better, like if you're emailing a teacher, about a question about an assignment or a grade or something, I think it's always like, it's okay to say like, hey, just reaching out as a parent about, so-and-so's whatever, just wanted to talk to you about it. It's okay for it to not be pleasant. You're not going to be pleased with every single one of your kids' teachers, although I'm sure they're all wonderful, Dr. Hackett. But it's okay, right? It's okay to not, disagreeing with them, not being happy with them isn't necessarily the same as not supporting them.
Okay.
It's when you're publicly saying, oh, your kid's coming into 5th grade. I hope she doesn't get so-and-so. She's the worst, right? Can't really do that as a board member.
Understood.
Okay, so where are we? Supporting, all right, so we just talked about this one. This was the reposting on Facebook. So I think we have one more section to go. Still awake over there, Bruce? Doing all right? Social media, proceed with extreme caution. I feel like that's the moral of the story so often in my presentations. All right, you can go ahead. So I think all of this had to do with social media. So I will refer all complaints to the chief administrative officer and will act on the complaints at public meetings only after failure of an administrative solution. So this gets at some of the questions that we were talking about earlier. If you see something, this is what you do. Not only if you see something, but if someone brings something to you, right? If you're minding your own business, you're just trying to get to the grocery store on a Saturday, and suddenly you're being accosted by parents, like, what is going on over at, so-and-so with so-and-so, right? Or, my child's teacher said the meanest thing. Thank you for letting me know. I'm going to give this information to the superintendent. She'll follow up with you. That's it. That's all you have to do. Let yourself off the hook. Let yourself off the hook. You do not have to solve the problems of the district on your own. You do the work of the board and committee and at board meetings. Everything goes to the superintendent. Go ahead. So evidence of the violation, that you took action to resolve a complaint or conduct an investigation or inquiry related to a complaint before referring it to the chief administrative officer or at some time and place other than a public meeting. Go ahead. So these are all pretty straightforward. C-2505, board members violated the code by going to the principal directly in connection with a parent complaint rather than referring the complaint to the superintendent. So, and I get it, like it makes sense, right? The principal is, at the top of the pyramid in the building, but again, as board members, it's just different. The other one, C-2407, board member violated the code by not providing the superintendent with letters that they had received because he didn't like the superintendent's management of the issues raised in the letters. So pretty clearly not proceeding through proper channels. All right. So I've got 3 slides that are just this, right? I'm going to just give you a quick example, but this is the conflict of interest section under the School Ethics Act. And so these are much more like thou shalt not. So, very straightforward. Subsection A, if they're no school official or member of his immediate family shall have an interest in a business organization or engage in any business transaction or professional activity which is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of his duties in the public interest. Okay. So these all speak to much more of those sort of professional and financial conflicts. No official shall use or attempt to use their official position to secure unwarranted privileges, advantages, or employment, right? So all of these sort of speak to more typical like integrity in governance sorts of things, no self-dealing, we're not on the take, we're not doing favors for people, we're not getting favors for our family. So the next 3 slides are just laying out all of the conflicts of interest. You guys can read them at your leisure. I see Monica looking. I promise you, I'm not going to read them all out loud. So you can go. All right. So you can go one more. Okay. So one thing to keep in mind when you are reading the conflict of interest provisions is that there's a sort of like weird tortured way of trying to figure out who's what. So you'll see under the School Ethics Act, it'll refer to members of your immediate family, relatives, or others. Okay. Separately, you guys have a board policy on nepotism that overlaps with some of this. And that comes from state regulation, and nepotism will strictly refer to a relative. So this is just where I go to whenever I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this person? Which category do they fall under? Okay, so it's just a little bit of a reference chart in case you're ever, curious as to who's who. And so it becomes relevant, next slide, more specifically when we were talking about conflicts of interest in negotiations and personnel matters. And this is where most of this stuff comes up. So if you are a member of a local union, an NJEA affiliate, if your spouse or partner is, if your dependent adult child who's still living at home is, that's going to conflict you out of a lot of negotiations. If you have a relative, that's sort of the next level, a sibling, a parent, an aunt, an uncle. If they're in district, it's going to create a conflict. If it's out of district, it might, depending on whether that person has leadership in their own local union, but it probably isn't. And then there's the the other section. So this just talks about spouse, dependent child, and relatives, because those are the ones that come up the most. And whether you can participate in negotiations, whether you can vote to ratify the contract, and whether you can participate in issues related to the superintendent. For the most part, if the conflicts are out of district, you're going to be able to vote on the final contract once the memorandum of agreement and salary guides have been achieved. So once all the financials have been worked out, the rationale behind this goes back to the conflict of interest provision about taking action for personal gain or for the gain of family, right? We all know that salary percentages are like this district depends on that district. We are looking at county averages. So it's possible that a settlement here could potentially impact a settlement somewhere down the road, in the same county. So that's where some of these conflicts come in, not even just the direct benefit, but even sort of that secondary, the higher the settlement here, the higher we settle for here, the more, so-and-so down at Eastern's going to get, and that's going to be more money in my pocket, right? So this is something just to keep in mind when we're talking about negotiations. You go ahead, and I'm going to try to.
Great chart. I love that chart.
What's that?
Yeah, that
Big
chart
fan
is
of charts.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
charts are, yeah. It's, listen, I swear, I do a conflicts chart before we start negotiations, right? Like the board members, who's who, right? That kind of stuff, because it just helps keep it straight.
Yeah. Shelley has a question.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
breaking out into cold sweats over here. So I have a niece who is subbing in the district. I didn't know that she was applying until after she applied. Is that a conflict for me?
Do you guys use a provider?
Yeah, we use ESS.
And it's fine. Interesting distinction. Glad you asked that. If your sub list was approved by the board, that would be a problem. But since she works for a third-party provider and all the board votes on is the contract with the third-party staffing company,
Oh, gosh.
you're good.
Oh my
I
gosh,
love
she's
her
about to
that-
resign.
I was about to
I'll
resign.
tell you, there are a ton of
I can't break this girl's heart.
there's a ton of ethics opinions on this, and you'll actually, I don't think I have it in here, and I won't make you sit through it because I know I'm gonna give me 10 more minutes and I'm gonna land the plane here. There's a lot to talk about here, and I know new board members will get ethics training. It's interesting though, because there's a lot of these, like the School Ethics Commission has made a distinction between in-house subs that the board hires and, ones that you get through third-party providers. They also actually opined fairly recently on a board member who was a bus driver with the company that the district contracted with. It was like a shared service agreement, and that, that bus driver board member was driving some kids in the district. And it was funny because like the School Ethics Commission almost went out of their way to be like, well, you really shouldn't, but like if you have to, go ahead, because we all need bus drivers. Like
Right.
I'm trying to be like ask if you could get a different route. It's really not good, is it? But if you have to, right? Like it was almost because everything else, like they're pretty clear on. But the point is they will weigh in on these things. fine. So if there's ever a question, we can always get an advisory.
But if there were a conflict with Kelly's niece, I mean, what would it would mean?
just
She would
abstain.
just abstain from the voting. It's
That's
not,
all.
she wouldn't have to, you wouldn't have to resign.
She's far enough removed from me.
Yeah, you would just have to abstain from the voting. There are nepotism, under your nepotism policy, right? Like there are relatives that cannot be hired. Substitutes are excluded, per diem substitutes are excluded from the nepotism policy, as are like kids who work summer programs in the district. But any other relative of yours cannot be hired by the district while you're a sitting board member.
What if they were hired before you were elected?
They're hired before you're elected, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
But you still have to abstain.
correct, yes, on any matter that could
I
impact
mean, I don't
their
have any
employment.
relatives. I'm just asking.
Yeah, but no, it is an interesting point. So for two reasons, the distinction between in-house subs and then external, but then also per diem subs and, you know, kids, your kids working in district are excluded from those nepotism regs. This is stuff for you guys to look at whenever you have time, because I want to spend more time on one more slide, but these are my 3 pillars of executive session. Say what you're going to say it, and then say what you said. So say what you're going to say. You've got to pass a resolution to go into executive session, tell the public what it is you're going to talk about. Then in executive session, you stay in that box, right? If we tell the public that we are talking about personnel and, you know, acquisition of land, those are the only things we talk about in executive session, because we didn't tell the public that we were going to talk about anything else in executive session. And then say what you said. That goes in the minutes. There are minutes kept for executive session. And the minutes can be made available when the need for confidentiality no longer exists. I give some examples in the next 2 slides about when the need for confidentiality no longer exists. You guys can look at them, you know, at your own leisure. We don't have to get into them now. Okay, so you can go one more and one more. All right, so this is my last slide. Okay, and you can just click through. I'd figured out you can just click all the way through. There's 6 of them. There you go. So these are just some of the things these are some tips for governance and boardmanship best practices. We can talk about the code all night long, but you know, there's aspects of being a board member that are just important that are not in the code. Number 1, and this is probably the most important thing, read the entire packet before the meeting. Get your questions answered before the meeting. Coming to the board table unprepared, bogging down the vote, bogging down consideration of a motion with questions that can be asked in advance, not good boardsmanship. Right now, sometimes it happens, sometimes you get confused, but as part of your duty, your commitment to your other board members here, read the packet. And again, it's for you guys to kind of figure out your processes internally. Do you want them, you know, do you want a superintendent, board president, you know, business administrator, committee chair? That's where I would, again, direct your questions, and then you guys can refine that and see how that's working. Limit your discussion of recommendations and action items to the board members. Do not engage with the audience, right? Very important thing here. This is the board's meeting. It is not like it has to occur in public. It's not the public's meeting. And they will come up here and tell you otherwise. This is the public gets to witness the board doing its business. They do not get to participate. They do not get to be heard on motions. They do not get to disrupt the meeting. They don't get to tell you in what order you get to go. You have to provide an opportunity for them to address you at every public meeting, but this is an opportunity for the public to witness the board doing its business. You are fundamentally here to do business. So anything that gets in the way of that is generally an impairment of your boardsmanship. So remember, the purpose of the meeting is to take action. Number 3, accept the actions of the board and support them when concluded. You know, do not continue to revisit things if you were in the minority on something and something moved forward. We're Voltron, okay? We all signed up to be in the band. We have to sing the same song. So you debate, you have your voice heard, you speak through your vote, but at the end of the day, you support the district moving forward with whatever it is the consensus of the board is.
And that also means, because this has come up quite a bit, 2 things. 1, not to go on social media and then talk about how you
exactly.
disagree.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
the
Yeah.
decision. Yeah, even if you voted and if we all voted, yes, everybody can wear sneakers on Mondays, and you were the one vote that said, no, you're not supposed to go on social media and be like, I said no because I hate sneakers and this is the stupidest thing. Like, you're not supposed to do that. But also, once we voted, then write the entire board on an email and say, I'm really not happy with this vote. Let's vote again because of X, Y, and Z reasons when you had an opportunity to discuss.
Yeah, and there's actually I tend to not get too bogged down in Robert's rules, but there's some specifics on that. When you can reconsider a vote, when you can retake a vote. Don't ask me to remember them now. It's been a long day. But I know you have to be in if it's like at the same meeting, it has to be like, there's got to be a motion to reconsider. There's got to be 2/3 affirmative vote to actually re-ask the question. And then I think it has to be brought by somebody who was on the winning side. It cannot be brought by someone. So if you've got a 6-3, one of the three can't continue to ask for a motion to consideration. Someone has to sort of indicate their willingness to reconsider by bringing that motion. So that is one where I do specifically know that the Roberts Rules procedures on, because otherwise it gets bogged down and people will continue to ask for revotes on things. So, you're not going to be happy with every decision the board makes. It's just how it is, but it's part of the group project. This is one big group project, and that gets difficult. This one's also really important. Number 4, adhere to the practice of no surprises. No surprises at the board table. Okay, this is the dining room. This is family, right? We've got company. Do your family business at the kitchen table. Okay, you ask your questions before the meeting, you talk to each other, you fight it out. You guys present a unified front to the public, because that is how the public has confidence in your schools. It's not that you don't see debate. It's not that you guys don't disagree, but you do it respectfully, and then ultimately you move forward together. So no surprises at the table, no surprise motions, no, dissension that hasn't been previously, addressed or discussed. It's a bad look. Mhm. Yeah, no, this is boardsmanship. This is absolutely about boardsmanship. I hesitate to estimate how many board meetings I go to in a year. It would say some things about my life I'm not comfortable saying. But it's a lot. And I've been doing this for about 10 years. And these are things that are true. There's with every procedure, every board procedure, everything that's not strictly codified by law, it's really easy to deviate from them and just be like, oh, it's just this one time. It happens all the time in public comment. Somehow we end up engaging in a back and forth, or we're not adhering to 3 minutes, and then we saw a lot of that getting tightened up during the pandemic, when public comment was becoming much more of a free for all and going on forever and ever. So it's one of those things where the rule exists for those situations, not necessarily the everyday situations. But it's one of when I talk about no surprises, it's about respect for other board members, respect for the superintendent, and again, valuing and buying into the idea that the board as a unified front is what gives people confidence in the district. And I'm not suggesting people can't have opinions or disagree. You debate every motion. If you're going to vote no on something, that's when you would say it, and you can say it there, and that's fine. It's one of those things where there's a courtesy in giving the superintendent a heads up, and not bringing something, not blindsiding, the superintendent with a question that maybe she doesn't have the information in front of her to answer, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and listen, it's an easy default position, right? People who are unhappy, like, you're all just up there bobbleheads, you're rubber stamping, you do, like, and as someone who it is, right? And it's funny because, as I said, I go to a few board meetings, and there's an enormous amount of work that goes into putting an agenda together and bringing forward these recommendations that is not always visible to the public. But you bring them forward in a way that's clean, efficient, and straightforward, so the public doesn't have to sit here through a 6-hour meeting, because I promise you, they'll do it once. They will never, ever want to see how the sausage gets made again.
Right.
They won't. It'll happen once and then that's it. So to your point, I think it's good to give a heads up and I think have the conversation about, I think it's important that we, I think it might be helpful for the public to know, because listen, like the more informed the public is, the better, I think. The more they can recognize and respect the amount of work that goes into doing what you guys do. So I think if there's something that you think that the public needs to know, again, committee chair, board president, superintendent, have the conversation before the meeting, figure out what that looks like. There might be some things that you wouldn't anticipate in saying that out loud, right? Like it might be one of those things where Dr. Hackett's like, all right, I can see that. Let me just call counsel. Maybe there's an issue with it. And then I'm like, no, don't do it, right? There's this thing that we're not thinking of, or do it at this meeting, or you know what I mean? Like you never know. It's one of the reasons why the whole point is no surprises, right? So put it out there and have the conversation. But absolutely, there are things that are good for the public to know. And I don't want to suggest that you don't want to debate or give information. I think it's just a matter of finding an efficient way to give that information in a way that, again, presents it as the work of a committee bringing forward a recommendation to the board. All right, we'll go down the line. Go ahead. To discuss like items that you're going to vote on. Yeah, and listen, that's a board decision, right? I think that's entirely a board decision.
We did move it up. It
Yeah.
was like this, if you saw on the agenda, it was second. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and listen, that's a tough one for boards, right? When you start out with executive session, like sometimes you have to move your meeting time up. Just like it, there's
It
no perfect way to
disengages
do
the
it.
Public, yeah.
There's no, sometimes you have it at the end and the superintendent talks about a recommendation that's coming next meeting, like it just kind of depends on what the board's needs are, but you can certainly do it at either time.
So you've mentioned the word debate a few times.
Mhm.
I love a good debate. When is this debate?
Yeah.
Because executive
Okay,
session
perfect.
is circumscribed.
Yep.
Right? There's
Yep.
specific things that we can talk about. So I wanna be Voltron, but there are times when I think debate is appropriate. And I think I'm struggling with how to recognize that this is not the appropriate forum necessarily for a debate, but yet there are debates that need to happen. So what does it look like?
Yeah. So look at number 6, right? You want to explain your vote, you do so during discussion rather than the call of the vote. So first we have a motion and a second. Then we have discussion, right? So if there's debate or discussion, or if you want to explain your vote procedurally, that's the moment to do it. Everyone has the opportunity to speak then, and that's after there's a motion and a second and before the vote is called. Okay, so that's the moment for debate. Now that's on a public motion. You do want to be careful, right? If the motion is to, hire someone, I don't want there to be a debate about, necessarily, specific details about that person, because there's some liability there that can get, and so that's where a personnel committee, right? Like being able to provide that information, bringing it forward to the board. These are the credentials. These are, this is why we did that. So if you have a specific question about an issue, again, before the meeting, superintendent. If there's a recommendation coming out of committee that you don't agree with, I would say go to the committee chair, talk about it. It's okay to disagree, and you don't have to vote yes on everything. But I would start having the debate with the people who did the work first, and then decide whether it is something that you want to discuss publicly or make those points publicly.
But you have to make sure, I just want people to realize, like procedurally. So like on the agenda, when we say, whatever, I was looking, can I get a motion to approve all of the items under personnel? Personnel is a bad example. Let's say it was finance, under finance. Then someone would say, first, second, that's when somebody has to say out loud, because I'm not always like looking for people to make, you have to say like, board president, I have a comment. then we won't vote because
Mhm.
obviously I like to keep the
Yeah,
meeting
yep.
moving. So just make sure you please speak out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yep. Yep.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think I was thinking that it was during board comments, but it's not. It's after there's the second on the motion to vote on the items. Okay.
So
Wait, hang on. I know,
I was gonna say something else different, but I want to dig into this a little deeper.
I'm just trying to
So
go in order
are
in
you
terms of
saying
questions.
you can make a comment as to maybe why you're about to not vote for something, but not an actual debate of asking questions, because your time to ask questions should have been when you
Correct.
review the agenda. You could have called a committee member who's the
Yep.
chair of that committee, or you could have reached out to Monica and the superintendent. Is that
Right,
correct?
so you can say, right, so motion second, we're in the discussion period. Listen, I know there were a lot of hard work that went into bringing this forward. I spoke with the committee chair, I've read the proposed policy. I'm not comfortable with it for this reason. Appreciate the opportunity to be heard. Thanks for the hard work of the board. You said what you had to say, and then you vote no. And that's that. So Helen wants to say something.
I know at a former district where I worked, we used to do it like, we would say, someone make a motion,
Mhm.
second, discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
Person would say discussion. the
Yeah,
president
I can
would
say discussion if
And
that
then
helps
the way we
everybody
would
to, like,
pause.
flag it for you.
Yeah.
I'm just not good at.
I've got board presidents who like,
Just worried we're gonna be
like,
here.
I'm
till
still trying to write down the
2:00.
second, and they're on the next motion, even when they say discussion, because it is one of those things of moving the meeting forward, motion second, any discussion, okay, let's go. So, but it is part of coming to the meeting prepared, right? Knowing that this is a motion that you're gonna want to comment on and being prepared to jump in once that motion's on the floor. All right, yes. So I'll answer your second question first. The opportunity is when the vote's on the floor. So, right, so they ask their questions beforehand, right? So their opportunity to be heard on it, if they're not if they're not on that committee, is when it comes to the board for a vote. If they have questions about why the recommendation is being brought forward, then that's the before meeting, go ask the questions and have those conversations. It's not everyone gets to participate in every decision, every recommendation that comes forward. And that's one of the hard things when you work, as a committee. You are assigned to a committee, and that's where you get to do your work and really sort of put your stamp on it. It's hard when you're not on another committee and you're not loving what's coming out of that committee, but that is part of being one of the group. So get your questions answered for sure. Make sure you understand the recommendation. Be heard at the table. If you're not cool with it, that's okay. Get your questions answered, try to get comfortable with it. If you're not, you do not have to vote yes on anything that you're not comfortable with. Oh, so in terms of the substance of what happens in committees, right? So yeah, I'm sorry, I did want to address that. So the committee is a process, right? There might be an idea floated, it looks like this, and then we pivot to this. So like, while it's in process, I don't really think it's appropriate to be kind of broadly sharing that information with the board. I'm not going to tell you it's like CIA top secret confidential, but you don't get into the details with other board members, right? They're not on the committee. It's the work of the committee. You want to give people the freedom to get comfortable with things, to think through things, to go through drafts, to work through that. It's easier to do that in a committee. It's one of the reasons why boards work through committee, because it's easier to ask questions and get up to speed and learn things and have some more frank conversations in the non-public committee structure. It makes for more efficient functioning. So you're not really supposed to be sharing minutes, sharing drafts, any of that kind of stuff. Once there is a recommendation that's being brought forward to the agenda, and that's why I say, to the question you asked earlier, in terms of getting questions answered, what am I being asked to vote on that I need this information for? So if it's still cooking in committee, right, there's nothing that's being brought forward to the board. So at that point, it's more curiosity, which I'm not mad about, but it's not necessarily something that you're going to bog down the superintendent, the board president, or even a committee chair, like you guys are volunteers, right? With, oh, explain to me what you're thinking and why you're thinking and that sort of stuff, right? You do that within your own committees, but not necessarily one that you're not on. I know that's a little unsatisfying, but that's just sort of for efficiency's sake, how it works.
No, I don't think that's what she said. And that's why that's supposed to flow through me. Because if you ask a
Right.
question, then I can disseminate to the entire board. So if, again, I'm going to use a stupid example. Yeah. It's not, you're not supposed to be having, at least I want to make sure that we're all hearing the same thing. And this is one of the reasons why we don't want separate side conversations, is because you may have heard X and then, Kelly heard Y, and then all of a sudden there's total misinformation on the board. So instead, the easiest way is to have like one flow through of
Yeah, and that's why I said, like, that's a board choice. I always say committee chairs are a resource, but it depends on how you want to operate. Because one of the things that I often put on this list that I didn't for brevity tonight, LOL, brevity, is that any information given to one board member should be given to all board members. So that's where if there's a question asked, now I think, and it really just depends on how much of a lift your board president can handle, right? So if you, yeah, and I think, and again, I think it's, it's a board decision. I think that there's a couple different ways it can happen, right? So I think when you talk to committee chairs, once something's on an agenda, they can then bring it to Monica and say, look, we've gotten a question about this. Can we put out some information? How do you guys handle committee meeting minutes? Do you guys share them?
so we give a overview at the meeting.
Yeah,
Okay.
they have a form, they kind of just write on it.
Okay.
The report at the meeting and.
Okay. So I was say like that's, I know like some boards use that. They'll do minutes for the committee meetings that people can read then, and like it answers some questions fundamentally. Right.
Yeah. Because it happened, the
Yeah.
meetings happen right before the meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that can be difficult, right? So that is one of those things that is, a governance, like a board retreat kind of conversation. Do we want to, try to look at, try to do minutes in advance or something, or find a way to give a little bit more information in advance? I would say work in your existing structure and think about what that might look like, see how it works, who it works for. And a lot of these things, I don't want to put Monica on the spot. Like it really depends on how much time your board president has to manage a lot of these things, right? You have a full-time job. It's not, there's other board presidents I have who are fantastic, who take on that role because they have more time to kind of be responding to the public and responding to board members and funneling a lot of this information. So I think it's a good question. The dissemination of information amongst board members, you have some ability to have those conversations and talk about what it might look like, but you adhere to your regular structure until there's a decision to do it otherwise. And listen, it's hard to get an agenda out, right? I know every board meeting, every board member, who I've ever had this conversation with, like, I just wish I get the agenda sooner, right? Everyone wishes they could get the agenda sooner. It's like a feat of, it's a massive feat to get the agenda out. And there's a lot of information on it. And I know it hits you guys, at the last minute with a lot of information. It's one of the reasons why this is a commitment. You get a big dump of information, you've got to sit and go through it. So it's a lot. And there's no one answer, right? I think that working through the board president, if they're, to the extent that it's coming up before the meeting and she can disseminate that information. Same thing with Dr. Hackett. I mean, if you're talking to Dr. Hackett, if it's information, Dr. Hackett knows the information that the board is going to want. She can funnel that back to the board president, share it out to the whole board.
Yeah, so I'm happy to do this however the board wants, but there are so many, you only know the emails that you send, that there's so many emails.
Right.
So instead of sending the board 700 emails, as much as we possibly can, I let it come through the board, like the boardogram. So it may not be as detailed, but if you want the detailed exchange forwarded to the entire board. Right.
Know what anyone else is asking, any information that they're getting, that they're, you know, that they're asking different questions, based on information, right? So I think that that's where I'm struggling is.
Well, and again, yeah, and again, I would just say, you're not going to have every piece of information you want. You're not going to have every detail that you would prefer to have to make a decision. And there's a learning process, you know. I agree, right? But it's also a matter of board members being circumspect in when they need to pursue additional information,
Right.
you know? And I think that's something that comes over time, is like getting used to the idea that you're not going to have all of that information.
That you're not gonna necessarily be an expert in every area. Like, if you're the chair of the policy committee, you're gonna be focused more on policy and maybe know less about something else. But outside of ethics, I know we're really running late here, but so I'm a committee chair for a committee that has yet to meet, the academic excellence, which I care very strongly about, and has come up repeatedly in comments from the public. We have test scores now, we have data that we're tracking. What is the mechanism for me to drive some of the, is there a mechanism for me to drive some of the conversation about that?
You tell Helen you want to have a meeting.
Yeah, the committee
That
meetings.
schedules it.
Oh,
Yeah.
great, okay.
So, can I? make
Any
a
of the
comment?
chairs can do that. Any person on, it does, you don't have to be a chair. If you have a topic you want to put on the agenda, like if you're not on the policy committee, but you have a policy that you think there's some sort of an issue, you just write the policy chair and say, I think this needs to be discussed. These are the reasons why. You may not be part of that discussion, but
That was my question. If you're not on that committee.
doesn't matter.
You're,
Yeah, as a
you
board
won't be
member.
Part of the discussion, but you will still be bringing
Yeah.
up.
Yes, and then you can ask the chair to give you the information, like what was decided, what was discussed.
Yeah, and that's within the code, right? You know, making, you know, like referring for study almost, right? Consulting with those who would be impacted.
Would you give the chair your point of view on it at the same time you ask
Yeah.
the agenda item?
Why not? Yeah.
Yeah, right. I think this policy is terrible. Like, please
Yeah.
consider doing it this way. This is why I think that, you know, that's
Actually think
fine.
that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, what?
That's
When
great,
you-
thank you.
So I really do feel for the new board members because
a lot.
I felt all of those same emotions, even when we were in the last executive session. I could feel it. I was like living it all over again. So it's hard because you want to do your best job. As a board member, you also want to do your best job for the community. These people elected you into this position. So I understand why, you know, you want to ask questions. I get that. It took me almost 3 years now to get to the point that I'm at now where, because I'm an inherent people pleaser, where I always wanted to ask the questions and I wanted everyone to seem that I was doing my job, what I was elected to do. As time went on and we were in some difficult situations, I had some people that were very close to me that we butt heads and they questioned every decision that I made. Of course, some of those decisions you can't discuss because they're confidential. So you finally get to a point where you don't want to be rude to anyone, but you have to say, you elected me for this position. You have to trust that I'm going to make the right decision. You voted for me for a reason. I'm here for a reason. Now you have to trust that the decisions that I make that I cannot disclose to you, that I'm doing the best job in the best interest of this school district.
And the best decision isn't always going to make you happy. Sometimes it's just the best of not a lot of great options. But, you know, the reason why we talk about boardsmanship and why I think it's important to have buy-in on the concept is because you've got to trust and respect that your fellow board members are as committed, dedicated, diligent as you are in making their decisions, in thinking about things, and in bringing recommendations forward to the board. You know, you guys have district goals. Everything is in furtherance of the same goals, right? It might look different if you three put together something as opposed to you three, but it's all in furtherance of the same mission. So it's not always going to be satisfying. It's not always going to be the way that you would do it. But part of boardsmanship is, I think, just trusting and respecting your fellow board members that they've put the time and effort into it. They've considered the recommendations of the administration, trust the expertise that they have when they're saying, this is how we should do it. That's a wrap. That's it. Anyone else? Anything?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Oh,
thanks.
I
Thanks
just
for
want,
hanging in there.
one last thing, Monica. Sorry, Monica. So in addition to you, though, we can also go to Marissa, right, as the vice president if we have, if,
Yeah, I mean,
so as a rule of thumb, like in the past for me, whether this is right or wrong, I don't know. I try to put as little in an email as possible. If I wanted to talk to, say, Dr. Hackett, I would say, could you please give me a call, for example, or the assistant superintendent in the past. But Monica, if she's busy, she has an employer, she's, working for someone else, I would sometimes text John and say, because he worked for himself, self-employed, can you give me a call? Because I don't want to bother her. She's working. So as a backup, we can go.
I think the easiest thing to do is
Marissa, or no?
to, when you send a note, send it to both of us. And then whomever gets back to you first, gets back to you first.
Okay, perfect. Yep.
Well, and I think in terms of committee chairs too, right? Well, you guys are working out what makes the most sense. I think just copy Monica, right? And then you guys can figure out how to filter out that information. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I know it's hard to do late at night. This stuff isn't super exciting. The Voltron slide was good though, right? And you guys all have trainings that you do, but this is just remember, knowing when to ask the questions. That's it. After 2 hours.
We still have to adjourn the meeting. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we'll need-
Oops.
Can I get a motion to adjourn?
I got to vote on that, huh?
Oh, yeah, I'm closed. I'm not out of
Oh, that's
this.
okay. Oh, I can do, we'll do you that. That's how's that? Okay, so.
So moved.
Oh,
Second.
wait. Sorry, I gotta find people's names. I'm like. We just did it. Who was second? I have Ken over first.
Then I was second.
Okay. Oops. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
So what else you guys want to talk about?
Thank you.
Hands adjourned. Thank you.
Bruce, do you want me to just leave this here?
Because I work in education.
Okay.
Where do you work?